What's the scariest thing you've woken up to in the middle of the night? Story 1. I had stumbled downstairs to get some water from the tap at about 2 a.m. I looked out of the window directly in front of me and stared into pitch darkness. You couldn't see anything more than a few feet. I turned the tap off, looked up, and there was a man's face just staring back at me. He was so close he practically had his nose to the glass. A face that made Gollum look like a model. This guy clearly looked dangerous. At least that's what my sleep-addled mind was thinking. I froze and just kept staring. He was also frozen and kept staring. Then he started pointing. He was pointing at the outside tap. He was pointing at the outside tap because he was a homeless man who was getting water for himself and his friends who had started living in the woods nearby. He smiled at me, a black-toothed grin, so I smiled back and nodded. He filled his water bottles and walked back to the woods. Over the next few months, I got to know them all, and they were super nice. They'd come for water and I'd leave them little care packages of food until they moved on to somewhere else, presumably to accidentally scare someone else in the middle of the night. Story 2. I woke up to my mom panicking, locking my door, and asking me to call the police. It was around 3 a.m., and someone had tried to choke her and possibly do worse. She said that she heard someone open her bedroom door and lie down on the corner of the bed. She called my name multiple times thinking it was me, but then someone tried to choke her and cut her with something. She managed to kick them off and ran downstairs into my room to protect me. Once the police came, they searched outside our home but found nothing. They asked if anyone else lived with us, and we said the only other person was a man who rented the downstairs basement, but he was never a problematic person. He went to church every Sunday and kept to himself. Honestly, he was barely there half the time because he was always working. They decided to speak with him anyway, and they found him in his room, watching adult content and bleeding heavily because he had accidentally cut himself when my mom kicked him off. It was terrifying. After that event, I had horrible sleep paralysis for several nights. I kept dreaming that a dark shadow would crawl into bed next to me and try to strangle me. I've had a lot of people say that I'm lying about this event, but I have no reason to lie. It was really traumatizing for both my mom and me. My mom didn't want to press charges because she was fighting for my sister's custody and didn't want the judge to see our home as an unsafe place because of the incident. My mom also wasn't legal at the time, so I think part of her was afraid she could be deported. Why did the police let him go? I couldn't tell you. I'm not a cop. I don't know how those things work. Even though they came and helped us, many officers in my town are very rude. My mom had previously called the police when her ex, my sister's father, gave her a black eye, and they did nothing. She has had a difficult life and has experienced a lot of injustice. It actually makes me want to cry when I read comments saying I'm lying because my mom was nearly assaulted, and possibly worse, and people think I made up a detailed story for attention. That's not the case. My mom is amazing, and I'm so grateful that her first thought was to run down to my room and protect me. Story 3. We had a rooster who was pretty aggressive, but he looked after the rest of the chickens. He was so aggressive, though, that only certain people could go near him. Otherwise, he'd attack and use his spurs. For a while, he had free reign of our yard, but we eventually had to pen him in because of his behavior. Well, he figured out he could kind of halfway fly out and get back into the yard after we'd all gone to sleep. One night, we woke up to what sounded like a young girl screaming at the top of her lungs. We ran outside to see what was happening, and old Bok Bok, that was his name, was walking around decapitated. He had picked a fight with a raccoon and lost. That sound he made that night still haunts my dreams sometimes. Story 4. This is my favorite story to tell. I'm absolutely terrified of home invasion type situations. I'll blame it on the copious amounts of true crime podcasts I listen to. So when I'm home alone, I constantly check the locks and sleep with a knife next to my bed. My husband went out of town for 2 nights. The first night, everything was fine. On the second night, I checked the doors, locked my bedroom door, and went to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the door rattling a bit. My first instinct was that one of the cats was pawing at the door wanting out. But once I fully woke up, I realized it was someone trying to twist the doorknob. I completely froze. My heart was racing, and I slowly reached for the light switch. Then I stopped, thinking maybe I shouldn't turn the light on and give away that I was awake in case I needed to hide or grab my knife. Our indoor doorknobs, if twisted hard enough, will just pop open. I finally heard it click, and the door opened just about 5 inches. I could see the outline of a man standing there, barely lit from behind by moonlight coming through the sliding glass door in the living room. So I sat there frozen, one arm halfway reaching for the light switch and the other for the knife, for what felt like an eternity. He just stood there, staring into the room, and I was convinced I was about to be attacked. Then the door opened a little more, and the man's outline became clearer. I barely managed to whisper my husband's name, and I heard back, "Yeah, why is the door locked?" He had decided the friend he was sharing a hotel room with was snoring too loudly and drove home 4 hours in the middle of the night. Story 5. I got up to go to the bathroom and didn't turn my bedroom light on, so I didn't see that anything was amiss. When I got to the toilet, I suddenly realized that my hands were covered in blood up to my elbows. It wasn't dripping wet, but it wasn't dry either. I didn't have any cuts or appear to have any injury of any kind. When I washed my hands, I checked everywhere. No injury. What on earth was happening? When I went back to my bedroom, I turned the light on, and half of my pillow was covered in blood as well, almost exactly down the middle. It was then that I realized I'd gotten a nosebleed and had been wiping at it in my sleep. It must have stopped just before I woke up, so there was no clue left on my body as to where I had bled from. I was living in a very dry area at the time, so nosebleeds were a common issue for me. That's the only time I've gotten one during my sleep, though. Story 6. About a year ago, I was woken up at 4:30 a.m. by someone walking into my apartment. I live alone. Oddly, after the first split second, "what just happened" reaction, I wasn't scared at all. I guess I just sensed there was no danger. It turned out to be the intoxicated guest of the guy in the apartment downstairs from me. She had taken his keys to go out for a smoke and then forgotten what floor he lived on. And my cheap landlord had reused a matching set of front and back door locks on 2 separate apartments, so they had the same key. She was very disoriented and way more freaked out than I was. I ended up escorting her to the correct apartment, and then she asked me for a hug. I have a new lock now. Then there was the time I woke up to the sound and shock waves of a blast destroying a nearby clinic. But that's a different story. Story 7. A home invasion. As I was laying sound asleep in my bed, I woke to a bright light shining on my face. I opened my eyes and saw 2 sets of legs and feet standing directly next to my bed. My first thought upon waking was that it was the police. I very quickly realized, though, that these were not officers. They were intruders. Amazingly, I didn't panic at all. Instead, I felt a sudden and intense surge of anger. I immediately jumped out of bed and began to yell at the top of my lungs, "Get out of my apartment!" I continued yelling like a chant. The intruders turned and bolted out of the apartment with me chasing after them. When I got to the patio door, I stopped. Since I was only wearing underwear, I found that all of my electronics were unplugged and ready to be stolen. However, everything was still there except for my CDs, which were gone. The police responded very well. They sent a forensic investigator to take prints from my apartment, and the detective in charge of my case even called me 2 days later to say no matches were found. I wasn't surprised. I think they were just a couple of reckless teenagers. I told the officer, how could they be so careless as to shine a flashlight into someone's face and not expect them to wake up? He said criminals aren't exactly known for their intelligence, which is one of the reasons they end up committing crimes. Good point. Only after those 2 individuals were out of my apartment did it occur to me that they could have been armed and might have panicked. It was only then that I felt the anxiety and fear kick in. Story 8. One night when I was sleeping over at my friend's house, his younger sister, who was apparently a sleepwalker, came into his room in the middle of the night, completely asleep, and sat down cross-legged at the end of his bed. She had a cup that they kept near the hallway bathroom sink, which she had somehow grabbed on her way in. She started placing the cup on and taking it off the end of one of her bare feet like she was trying on shoes, all while half singing, half humming the Gem and the Holograms theme song. To someone like me, who had never witnessed such behavior before, it was a jarring and confusing sight to wake up to. It was more than my 13-year-old brain could process. But my friend just laughed it off and explained that she sometimes sleepwalked and sang songs, and that it had been happening since she was younger. He was used to it. Despite my friend's relaxed attitude about it all, I can honestly say I wasn't too eager to sleep over there again. Story 9. Probably the time I was sleeping at my deer hog camp, and I woke up and was staring at a pair of eyes through the window. There was just enough light for me to see it reflect off those eyes. The smell. I knew the smell, and it was blood. It was unlike anything I've smelled before or since. I've smelled burning flesh, decaying bodies, meth labs. Nothing smelled like this. So of course I yelled, grabbed my rifle, and ran outside. But when I got out there, nothing. No tracks, nothing but dead silence, and 4 dead and partially eaten dogs. We never heard them bark, and some of those dogs were incredibly aggressive. I had a trained dog, my general purpose protector. I trained him as a guard dog, retriever, and hog hunter. This dog never trembled, but he was under my bed, absolutely terrified, to the point that he lost control of his bladder and bowels. My buddies lost 2 dogs each, and to this day we still don't know what killed them. We even had a necropsy performed, and the vet said whatever it was, it killed them instantly. The dogs didn't suffer, and there was no evidence of any known animal capable of doing that. I sold the camp the next day. Story 10. The blood-curdling screams of a family friend as he realized he had just taken his girlfriend's life. I can still hear him, repeatedly yelling, "I killed her! I really killed her!" over and over again. I remember jolting awake and opening my bedroom door to find him standing there with huge gashes all over his stomach. He was bleeding everywhere, crying, and begging someone to tell him what to do. My mother stood there trying to calm him down, holding pressure on his wounds and trying to stop the bleeding. But it was really bad. She shoved me back into my room and told me to wait for her. Not knowing what else to do, I listened. He cried and screamed in front of my bedroom door for what felt like an hour, but honestly, I'm not sure how long it really was. Eventually, my mom came in and explained that he had been drinking and driving. He hit black ice on a turn and flipped his car. They said his girlfriend died instantly, but he hadn't known that for sure when he left the scene and came to our house. I was told never to speak about that night, and for a long time I didn't. He eventually turned himself in and is currently serving a life sentence. It's a horrific memory, but I will say it taught me never to drive impaired, and for that I'm grateful. Story 11. When I was in middle school, my grandmother stayed the night while my parents were away on vacation. She came into my room at 3 a.m. and asked, "Do you have any friends over?" I told her no, and she walked down the hallway. Confused, I rolled over to go back to sleep when I heard something that sounded like breathing from behind my door. "Hello?" I called out, only to see a shadowy figure appear from behind my door. From the light in the hallway, I could see it was a tall man in a leather jacket. He looked over at me and said, "You all right? You good?" I was completely stunned and confused, and I muttered a quick, "Yup," trying my hardest not to freak out. Then this guy walked over and sat on my bed, looked at me and asked, "Do you want me to let your dogs out for you?" Now keep in mind I was going through a phase where I slept in the nude, so I was just lying there exposed with a complete stranger sitting on my bed. I eventually replied, No, they're fine. Do you need help getting out?" He nodded and walked out of my room. I quickly threw on some sweatpants and followed him down the hallway to the front door, where I saw him struggling with the doorknob. "You gotta push, then pull," I told him. He finally got it open, ran down the front stairs, and just as he did, a police car pulled into our driveway. He saw the officer, turned around, and ran straight into our basement. We lived in a raised ranch. The cop shouted, "Hey, does that guy live here?" I shook my head no, and he released his K9 unit into the basement. After 10 minutes of searching, they gave up. Apparently, the man escaped through a window. He was never caught. Several cars on our street had been broken into, and a nearby gas station had seen him trying to force open the front door. Story 12. When I was young, my parents visited London a lot. One time we stayed long enough to rent a flat with one of those tiny little balconies on the 5th floor of the building. I stayed on the fold-out couch in the living room next to the balcony, and my parents stayed in the master bedroom. It was a nasty hot summer, so one night my dad decided to leave the window open without telling my mom when we went to sleep. That night I woke up to the sound of my mother screaming, not in fear, mind you. No, this was the full-on, furious scream of a woman about to go into battle. I bolted upright just in time to watch a shadow fly across the room and literally leap out the balcony window, with my mother charging after him, flailing her arms and screaming at the top of her lungs. She ran all the way to the balcony and kept screaming into the night. I don't know how he got away from her. I just know that in that moment, I was more terrified of her than I was of the guy she was chasing. He must have been scared too. I've never seen a thief run that fast. Story 13. When my parents were getting ready to divorce, they both made an agreement to have separate bedrooms. My dad used to pretend to sleepwalk. He used this excuse in case he got caught, and would just stand at the edge of my mom's bed to watch her while she slept. One night I slept in my mom's room with her and woke up to see my dad standing there. He obviously didn't realize I was in the room and freaked out. Nobody had believed my mom, but from that moment on, I never doubted her. A year later, my father attempted to take his own life with a firearm, and before he tried to do it, he told me he should have harmed my mom when he had the chance, which means all those times he had been standing in her room watching her, he was contemplating doing something terrible. I still panic when I think about all of this and just how unstable my dad has become. It's incredibly painful to genuinely fear someone you love. Story 14. I was driving for 13 hours in my Jeep Cherokee, pulled into a hotel off the road and parked, jumped in the back seat to sleep, windows tinted. I heard scratching and metal grinding, poked my head toward the front window where the noise was coming from, and saw a car thief trying to break into my Jeep. Full-on ski mask and everything. He jumped, startled, and said, "Oh no!" then ran off to a van waiting near the entrance, and they took off fast. The craziest part is that I just went back to sleep because I was so tired. They probably could have come back with a weapon. In the morning, I checked my lock outside and realized they were probably just 2 seconds away from clicking it open and getting in. Then things really could have gotten interesting. Waking up mid-joyride, haha. Story 15. This happened a couple of years ago, but it comes up frequently in conversation because of how much it freaked me out. Anyway, I woke up and was completely alert. I just lay there for a moment, confused, before I heard a faint sound, like the bass of a song being played in a faraway car. I looked at my phone, and it was exactly 3:30. I mentally shrugged it off and tried to go back to sleep. Suddenly, there was a very loud and distinct drumming sound. Boom, boom, boom! A deep and steady rhythm, and I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I was very confused, but strangely calm. Then I heard someone walking around the house, so I grabbed my tiny little pocket knife and went to investigate. Walking into the hallway, I ran right into my mom, who was literally shaking. She had also woken up at exactly 3:30 and was very disturbed. We spent the next few minutes in a panic, running from window to window, trying to locate the source of the drumming. The sound eventually stopped, and we nervously laughed it off, saying, "Okay, that was weird." But I was scared and asked to sleep in my mom's room. I was a nervous 12-year-old. We went back to her room, and the drumming sound started again. This time it sounded like it was right outside the window. My mom went to the window, and the drumming suddenly started moving around and sounded like it was inside the house. It only lasted a moment after that, and then it was silent. We never heard it again. I jokingly asked my neighbor about it the next day, and she said, "Yeah, I heard it too. I thought you guys were playing drums in your house. Weird that my dogs didn't bark, though." It still freaks me out to this day. Story 16. A group of friends and I were hiking and camping in the winter during our winter break. We shared a group tent. There were only 6 of us. On the last night of the trip, we decided to head to bed early to get extra sleep for the long hike home. Around 3 a.m., I heard a pinging noise, sort of like what you would hear if you threw a BB pellet at a tin roof. It was quick, just 1, 2, 3. I thought nothing of it and figured it was all in my head, until 2 other friends quietly asked if anyone else had heard the pinging noise. We decided to wait for a minute, grab our pistols and flashlights, and slowly venture out of the tent to see what was causing the noise. We found a man, stripped of his clothing, no longer alive, in front of our campsite, half covered in snow. There were 3 wounds, one to the neck, another to the lower region, and the last to the upper leg. A friend and I immediately began climbing to find a spot with service. Night hiking in snow is horrible, don't do it, and called 911. Roughly 45 minutes later, an EMT helicopter arrived and picked up the body, while a squad of forest rangers combed the woods surrounding us. The person was never identified and is now buried in an unmarked grave near my hometown, where I was attending school. I'm not well versed in pistols and silencers, but I can only assume the pings we heard were the rounds being fired. Story 17. A group of 5 to 10 men stormed into my room with flashlights on their faces and helmets on. They immediately dragged me out of bed while I kicked them in the face. Or at least that was my perspective. It turned out those people were police officers in full riot gear conducting a full-on drug raid on my flat. Apparently, someone had tried to break into my apartment, and when my neighbors called the police, the intruder spun a story about how he was just trying to break my window as revenge over a drug debt. He convinced them that the apartment belonged to some major drug dealer he had issues with. I guess he was trying to plead down to property damage. So they came in aggressively. Thankfully, after a quick search and about 10 minutes of me on the floor with my hands behind my head, plus an hour of answering questions, I managed to convince them that I was, in fact, just a call center worker and not some criminal kingpin. I still get nervous around the police. Story 18. My family was staying in a hotel for an extended family. Dad's cousin, maybe. Member's wedding when I was about 5. My older sister and I were in the bed near the door. She was afraid to sleep near the window. I was closest to the door. Then my sister and my parents were in the second bed near the window. It was pitch black in the middle of the night when our door opened, waking me up. I looked up and saw the shadowy figure of an older man in a trench coat with a fedora. Just the silhouette. I, of course, freaked out and started screaming, waking up half the floor. Turns out there was a mix-up at the front desk, and they had given our room key to a great uncle with the same last name and a very similar first name, one letter apart. Think Gerard versus Gerald. My sister and I didn't sleep for weeks. Story 19. We armed the security system and went to bed. A couple of hours later, we were woken by the blaring intrusion alarm telling us there was motion in the basement. The police were called as I grabbed the Glock and peered down the basement steps. I slowly began my descent when suddenly I thought I saw a person in red running away from the landing. My heart rate skyrocketed, and I bolted back upstairs, closed the door, and waited for the police. They arrived within minutes and lit up the house from the street. Turned out one of the cats had snuck down into the basement earlier in the evening without anyone noticing and had triggered the motion alarm. When I thought I saw someone in red, it had actually been light scattering off a surface from the laser sight on the Glock. The police had a laugh and wished me a good evening. It was just the cat. 2. I woke up after hearing an incredibly loud bang from across the house. I thought maybe someone was trying to break down a door. I made it to the kitchen and saw the freezer door wide open. Got closer and realized I had forgotten a can of soda in there, and it had exploded, blasting the freezer door into the wall and leaving sticky soda slush all over the place. Story 20. Not me, but my brother. About 3 summers ago, my older brother was home alone because my parents and I had gone on vacation, and he had reached the age where he didn't have to come. He probably enjoyed having the house to himself. Naturally, he had a lot of friends over, but one night, he didn't have anyone staying over. He has an ensuite bathroom that leads to the hallway, and he remembers opening his eyes and seeing a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching him sleep. When the figure saw that my brother was waking up, he slowly closed the door and ran out of the house. At first, my brother thought it might have been a friend staying over, but when he realized he was alone that night, he jumped out of bed and walked into the hallway. When he got there, he saw a man at the bottom of the stairs running out the back door. So he chased him out onto the driveway and shouted at him to stop. Apparently, the guy turned around and pulled out a 6-inch knife he had taken from our kitchen and told my brother that if he came any closer, he'd hurt him. So my brother told him to just leave. The guy had 2 bags full of stuff he had stolen from around the house, but he must have gotten spooked because he ended up ditching them in a hedge nearby. My brother is a big guy, about 6 feet 6 inches. They found the man a few days later because he was walking down the street wearing my brother's oversized parka jacket that he had taken. The only things he ended up keeping were a Kit Kat and 2 fortune cookies. Story 21. I woke up around 4 a.m. to find a large, mentally unstable homeless man standing in my bedroom, about 3 inches from my face. He was so huge that he broke in by forcing his way through the deadbolt. He was talking to himself and staring closely at me while holding a screwdriver. I guess between the adrenaline and the sleepiness, I didn't immediately realize what was happening and just stared up at him. Thank goodness he eventually just left. He didn't steal anything except a light bulb, which I later found outside in my bike basket, and the screwdriver. He did go through our kitchen and bathroom cupboards, took our coats out of the closet, and even took down any art or photos on the wall that had visible eyes in them, leaving everything else hanging. The creepiest part was that there was evidence he had been to our apartment before, and possibly again afterward. I picked him out of a lineup, and he was held briefly. But since he didn't physically harm anyone, it was a minor charge. Story 22. My dogs rarely get much outside time, unfortunately, which means they don't do well with other dogs or people. Whenever I get a package at my door, my dogs literally jump at it and bark like it's the end of the world. Anyway, one night at exactly 2:35 a.m., I heard my dogs barking like crazy. Not like when a mail carrier or someone harmless shows up, but like their lives depended on it. I tried to ignore them, figuring it was maybe a deer in the yard or just strong wind. Shortly after the barking stopped, I heard one of my dogs crying loudly. At this point, I had no idea what was going on and decided to slowly go downstairs, like I was in a horror movie. When I got downstairs, everything seemed fine, but my dogs were overly excited to see me. I checked the security camera and saw two men in black clothing walk up to my front porch and stare into the windows for a solid 5 minutes. That's when the dogs started barking, and the men quickly left. I don't know what they were there for, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't to talk to me about their faith. Story 23. A break-in at my grandpa's house. My younger siblings, cousins, and I were staying the night there. The back door that led to the yard was in the living room, but for some reason, no one ever used that door. We always used the front or side door. I was sleeping closest to the back door, and in the middle of the night, I heard the doorknob jiggle. I knew something was wrong. No one used that door, especially not in the middle of the night. I pretended to be asleep, but my heart was pounding as the door opened and someone came in. Even though I was only 12, I knew better than to scream or move. This was Detroit, and I knew intruders could be dangerous. I didn't want to put myself or anyone else at risk. I squinted my eyes and could see a dark figure moving toward the TV. The intruder took the video game system, the box of video games, and left. After he left, I lay there thinking he might come back, but I was too scared to move. I stayed still until daylight when my grandpa came into the room and asked what happened to the games in the console. Story 24. An attempted break-in. Our dog woke us up barking. She was still a puppy, maybe a year old at most. She had never been a barker. My wife went into the kitchen and looked out the back, only to be startled by a man standing there. She screamed for me. He started asking her to let him in, claiming that people were chasing him. Then he began testing the door, the windows, and eventually a door that led to our bedroom, which unfortunately had been left unlocked. A mistake we definitely no longer make. We have kids, and I was terrified. I went and grabbed a serrated knife meant for sawing small pieces of wood. He started sliding open our back bedroom door and had already put one leg in. We have curtains covering that door, so I could tell he was entering, but he didn't know I was there. I flung open the curtains and yelled, "Get out of my house!" And he stumbled backwards, clearly terrified. I'm certain he was under the influence of something. My wife had already called the police, and they arrived soon after. They ran through our house to the backyard with shotguns ready. They searched the neighborhood for hours but hadn't found him the last we heard. Other neighbors had called the police about him too. Story 25. I was laying in bed one night when I heard my car horn go off. My wife and I woke up and looked out the kitchen door. We live in a rural, wooded area. A single pole light lit the area where our two cars were. No flashing lights, no sounds. We turned around, but before we made it back to the bedroom, I heard it again. My wife stood at the door and watched as I walked out onto the porch. I thought it was her van, so I walked down through the clearing and got in. Looked around, nothing. I turned the car on, then turned it off. That's when I heard the horn again. It wasn't the van, it was my truck. My hair stood on end. I was terrified as I turned to look. There was a person in a hoodie sitting in my truck. He honked the horn again without turning his head. The weird thing is, I didn't get angry or scared. I didn't feel threatened. He was sort of nodding back and forth, disoriented. I walked over and said, "Hey man, what are you doing?" He slurred his speech a little. I opened the door, and he was covered in blood. He looked about 18. We spoke for a minute, and I finally pieced together what had happened. He had crashed his own truck and hit his head pretty badly about 100 yards down the road. He stumbled back, saw my truck, it was the same make and model as his, and got confused trying to start it with his own keys. He didn't smell like alcohol. He definitely had a mental health issue. I asked for his phone and called his parents. They answered with, "Where is he this time?" That really hurt to hear. I stayed with him until they arrived. said hello, wished them well. I saw his truck in the ditch the next day on my way to work. Story 26. At 2:30 a.m. on a Monday, I heard the door in my room open. The lights came on and I heard a voice say, "Wake up." Two men I had never seen were standing there, each pointing a gun at me. They took me to my brother's room, where my brother and his fiancée were bound and gagged. My infant nephew was asleep but soon woke up, which obviously stressed out his parents. They pleaded with the intruders for the baby's safety. The men made me remove the battery from my phone and hand it over. Then they made me pack up my clothing, TV, gaming console, and more to give to them. They kept saying that now their kids would have something to play with. They led me downstairs, one of them keeping a gun pointed at my head and even blowing into the barrel. Then they took me to my parents' room, also bound and gagged. They took the cars, food, clothing, everything. We later found out they were police officers. We tried to file a report, but it was denied because it was outside working hours. When we eventually succeeded, we received a call from the police asking for ransom for the cars. We didn't pay, so we never got them back. This happened in Venezuela about 5 years ago. Things have only gotten worse since. Story 27. Camping in the state woods or game lands, so not a campground with neighbors or anything. Just a clearing in the woods with a parking spot about a football field away. It was just me, my best friend, both of us are women, and the dog. It was our second night there. The first night we'd heard plenty of drunken guys off-roading well after dark. I was woken up by my best friend whispering, "Did you hear that?" I listened. Silence. Then she said again, "He said, 'Be quiet,'" or something like that. It's been a couple of years. Now I was on high alert. I was sleeping next to a loaded weapon, so I slowly and quietly reached for it, trying to hear whatever it was she had heard, without alerting anyone, or anything. Then she mumbled again, but this time it was just gibberish. I whispered back, "What?" She responded again, but it was complete nonsense. That's when it hit me. The dog, who had been super protective the whole trip, was still sound asleep. And that's when I learned, after 20 years of friendship, that my best friend talks in her sleep. Story 28. When I was a really little kid, about 4, I woke up to a faint glow coming from my window. I looked out and saw the house of my only neighbor at the time covered in flames. Unfortunately, I was too young to understand what fire was. I got up and toddler hobbled over to my mom's bedroom door and tried to open it. It was locked, so being the strangely well-behaved kid I was at the time, I quietly went back to bed. The neighbors were a really kind elderly couple, and they passed away in that fire. It was the perfect storm. The husband couldn't walk without a wheelchair, the wife needed a cane, the smoke alarms had stopped working and hadn't been fixed, and they had been asleep when the fire started. Their caretaker, their granddaughter, had gone out with friends that night. By the time they woke up, the bedroom door was already blocked by flames. They both suffocated, and their bodies were badly burned. The house was reduced to barely a foundation by the end. When I was 10, I rediscovered this memory and needed therapy. I blame myself, and honestly, I still do. Story 29. My bedroom overlooks the patio in the backyard. At night it gets very dark because of the trees and dense foliage, and it's also very secluded since it's hard to access the backyard due to the heavy growth along the sides of the house. There's a back door in the kitchen which, for some reason, has a doorbell, installed by a previous owner. It makes no sense to be there because no delivery person or solicitor would even think to go into the backyard. Anyway, it was a literal dark and stormy night, so I had trouble falling asleep. Once the weather calmed down, I dozed off. Sometime later, around 2 or 3 a.m., I was woken by the sound of the doorbell. I barely registered it, thought I had dreamt it, or maybe it was just kids messing around. But then I remembered, the back doorbell has a completely different sound than the front, and this wasn't the front. Still, I drifted back to sleep, assuming I imagined it. Then 10 minutes later, I heard it again, clear as day. My mind started racing. Should I look through the curtains at the back door? What would I see? I was in full panic mode. A minute or two later, it rang again. I called the police. They said they'd send a unit. Eventually, the front doorbell rang and I got a phone call letting me know an officer was at the door. I let him in, and he said he'd walk the perimeter. He didn't find anything. Even he admitted it would have been nearly impossible for anyone to reach the backyard just to prank someone. I never did find out who or what rang that doorbell. To this day, I still wonder, is it better that I don't know? Story 30, Sleep Hanging. For those who don't know about prison life, the scariest part of your sentence can be who you're housed with. There are some truly disturbed individuals. I had an extremely unstable cellmate. He was being transferred for assaulting an officer, just like I was, so they housed us together. The difference? I was doing time for robbery. He was in on multiple counts of murder. Sure, neither of us were saints, and I can be violent when I have to be, but this guy was on a completely different level. That said, we got along fine. I wasn't a pushover, so nothing happened to me, and he didn't take my food or try anything. Several nights in a row, he kept saying he didn't want to be transferred to the max security prison they were sending him to. That's common in prison. People want to avoid enemies, stay closer to family, etc. But the only ways to avoid transfer are acts of desperation, suicide attempts, assault, or worse. One night after his usual ranting, the lights went out and we went to sleep. I had the top bunk. I woke up choking, abruptly, violently. He had crafted a makeshift noose out of a sheet, looped it around my neck while I slept, and was pulling with his feet braced against the bottom of my bunk. In prison, this is called sleep hanging. There was absolutely nothing I could do. The pressure was unbearable. I felt like my neck would snap. As I was blacking out, I saw a bright pinpoint of light and thought, this must be it. Then I heard a loud voice scream, "Get off of him!" followed by banging on the cell door. The light was a guard's flashlight during a routine check. Seconds later, the doors rolled open and 3 officers rushed in. I was taken to the prison ward for oxygen. My throat was nearly crushed. I still don't know if he timed it knowing the officer was coming or if he genuinely tried to end my life. Either way, it changed me forever. Story 31. I used to live in a very old house that had been divided into 3 separate apartments. Mine was on the top floor. Each apartment had its own screened-in back patio/balcony. It was amazing walking out there and being among the treetops of massive oak and maple trees. It was the best part of the place. My bedroom was connected to that special outside room, and more than once I woke up to the sound of the doorknob jiggling. It scared me to death the first time. I was certain someone had climbed up the fire escape, cut the screen, and was trying to get in through a door that didn't even have a lock. After a few minutes, I wondered why they hadn't come in, so I got up and looked. Nothing. Then I started waking up to the sound of something heavy rolling through the kitchen. Again, scared, confused. I talked to my downstairs neighbor about the weird stuff, and he told me the house used to be a treatment home for tuberculosis patients. That explained the outdoor rooms. Fresh air was the only treatment back then. He joked that maybe the noises were the ghost of someone in a wheelchair. I thought he was messing with me, so I asked the landlord. He confirmed it. Apparently, my unit used to house a little girl who passed away in my bedroom. Story 32. One night I woke up and realized something warm and alive was leaning against my right calf. I figured that if I moved and startled whatever it was, it might escape and I would never have closure or be able to sleep again. As I lay there motionless, running through the possibilities in my head, I just got more terrified. It was hairless, so it wasn't my cat or some mammalian pest. It was warm, so it wasn't a reptile or amphibian either. It felt human. I sleep alone, but I did a very slow turn of my head to confirm that no one was in my bed. I lay there panicking for a few minutes before deciding that whatever it was, I needed to catch it so I could know for sure. In one quick movement, I sat up and clamped my hand down over it and began to lift the covers. It was my left foot, which had fallen asleep to the point that I couldn't feel it pressing against my other leg. Never have I felt so stupid or so relieved. Story 33. I'm in my house, just my dog and me, asleep. I wake up to a really loud thunderstorm. As I lay in bed trying to fall back asleep, the thunder roars. It's so close that the windows shake a bit. Then I hear it, a faint scream. I think my mind is playing tricks on me. But the thunder roars again, and again I hear the scream. Holy crap, I think it's coming from inside the house. I'm freaking out, trying to figure out what to do. The thunder booms again, and this time I know for sure the scream is in the house, and I know exactly where it's coming from. I look up while standing in the hallway. The attic door is closed, but something is clearly screaming from inside the attic. I don't know what to do. I'm completely freaked out. As the thunder fades in the distance, I hear one last faint scream from the attic. Finally, it hits me. My Halloween decorations are up there, and I have an electric chair prop that screams like it's being electrocuted. It's sound activated. I had accidentally left it on, and the thunder was loud enough to trigger it. I was absolutely terrified until I figured it out. Story 34. My boyfriend and I were sleeping, and in the middle of the night, I felt him moving the pillows around on the bed. I woke up to see that he was sitting upright, half awake, half asleep. He mutters casually, "There's a snake in the bed," and then lays back down. I immediately start freaking out, but also freeze with fear. I begin shaking him. Side note, we had just moved from the tri-state area down south, so I felt like the chances of this happening were higher. "What? What are you talking about? Where?" He replies, "Oh, it's over there," and casually points over me toward my side of the bed, which I wasn't even facing. He dives back into unconsciousness, completely impossible to wake up, and I'm left wide awake, absolutely terrified and nearly in tears. Of course, there was no snake in the bed. The following morning, he wakes up all smiles, totally unaware of what happened during the night. He thought it was hilarious. Now looking back, I laugh too. He's done a lot of weird things in his sleep, but this one scared me the most. Story 35. Late to the party and not the middle of the night, but this legit messed me up. I was taking a nap with my 3-year-old son at about 4 in the afternoon, 7 years ago. Dead asleep, I suddenly felt my arm violently yanked from my side and thrown behind me. At the same time, I heard, "Wake up!" yelled in a strange man's deep voice. I was so startled, totally confused and dazed, but my son was still sound asleep next to me. So I figured it must have been a weird sleep paralysis episode and got up for the rest of the day. I kept thinking about it, though. It just didn't sit right. A year later, my sisters, my fiance, and I were sitting around having drinks and talking about weird things that had happened to us. I brought up that situation, explaining how I thought it was sleep paralysis, but still found it incredibly bizarre. I turned to look at my fiance, and his face was pale and he had literal tears in his eyes. He said he distinctly remembered that day. He had been sitting in the living room when he heard a man yell, "Wake up!" loudly and forcefully. He genuinely thought someone had broken into the house and searched around, but didn't find anyone. He's always been a skeptic, not someone who believes in the supernatural. But that moment shook him, and now he's not so sure anymore. Story 36. This might not be what the original post is looking for, but it happened to me. I don't expect anyone to believe me, because I know how crazy this sounds. When I was home from college during summer break, I experienced what I think was a night terror, or at least that's how I rationalized it. It happened a few times starting after freshman year. It still happens to me, but very rarely, maybe once a year or less, and never as intense as the first time. My parents lived in a trailer, so space was tight. I shared a bedroom with my younger brother. We had bunk beds, I had the top bunk. I had a dream that I still can't recall in detail, but I remember it wasn't a nightmare. I was laughing in my sleep. Even as I was waking up, I was still laughing. The room was dark, probably around 3 a.m. No lights on, barely any from outside. As I woke up and rolled from my side to my back, I saw a black mass hovering above me, near the ceiling. It looked like smoke but didn't drift. It had a defined shape, a torso with no limbs and a head. The eyes were glowing bright yellow. No pupils, no irises, just pure energy. I stared at its eyes and started crying silently. It tilted its head slightly toward me, just a subtle movement, and the eyes pulsed, like they flared brighter for a moment. It was like it wanted me to know it was real. That was when I could finally move. I kicked at it and screamed. My parents rushed in and said I was curled up and looked like I was convulsing. They shook me awake, and I was okay. I had knocked the lamp out of the wall when I kicked. I hate talking about this, because I know how it sounds. Even writing it now, my hands are twitching. Believe it or not, it changes nothing. I know what I saw, and I wish I could forget it. Story 37. When I was about 8 or 9, my cat Fifi would often go outside and then come back in through my sister's window. Her room was next to mine. Even though she used that entrance, she had chosen me as her person and always came to sleep in my bed. One night, I felt Fifi jump onto my bed and woke up to see her drop something furry and dark on top of my blanket. I immediately started screaming my head off. I can only imagine the terror my parents must have felt, because they burst into my room seconds later, my sister's right behind them. My dad turned on the light and looked where I was pointing and saw a rabbit's foot, but not a bloody fresh one that Fifi had hunted. No, it was a purple rabbit's foot from my sister's keychain. I've never lived that moment down. Fifi lived to be 20 and was a fabulous toy hunter her whole life. I miss her every day. Story 38. Not exactly in the middle of the night, but I was woken up by my wife saying there was a nuclear missile headed our way. I looked at my phone and saw the same emergency alert. At the time, we were staying in a hotel in Waikiki, while our kids were back home on the other side of Oahu, in Kailua, with my parents. We had left the kids with them so we could celebrate our anniversary that weekend. My wife and I remained surprisingly calm and focused as we quickly got dressed and packed a few things to head to the car. We were on the phone with my parents and kids, and they had also received the same message. We stayed on the phone with them the entire drive back, even after we found out the alert had been sent in error. It was a surreal early morning drive, rushing home, trying to outrun what we thought was an incoming intercontinental missile. Story 39. Sleep paralysis. Feeling like you're wide awake and able to see around you, trying to get up and make it to a seated position on the side of your bed, only to immediately be warped back into your bed, lying down with the covers over you. You're fully conscious, but this loop keeps happening, and it's exhausting. Each time you try harder to get out of bed, and each time you reappear back in bed, more tired than before. A dark presence fills the air, and the covers feel like someone is physically holding you down. You don't know what's happening. All you know is you want to get up. You can't get up, and the room is filling with this oppressive, terrifying energy. This has taken a few different forms for me, sometimes with more lucid looping, and sometimes with an immediate dark being present. The first time it happened, I was thoroughly shaken to my core. I couldn't get a grip on reality for the first hour after waking up. Story 40. A car accident. My boyfriend and I had been at Katsucon all day, having a great time like we do every year. We were planning to go to the cosplay prom, but by the time we were going to get changed, we felt too tired to bother. So we left. We grabbed McDonald's. It was hailing, raining, terrible weather. It was dark. I put my feet up and tried to finish a Scientology documentary on his laptop. I fell asleep, and I woke up in what I can only describe as the closest approximation to hell. We were spinning, bright lights against the dark. I was screaming. He was saying something I couldn't even process. The car slammed into two things, I think. I screamed louder when I realized he wasn't next to me. I assumed I would leave the car and find the person I love, like salsa on the highway. And I was very ready to join him in that fate. But then I heard the back of the car open and saw him shove the bumper back inside. He managed to drive us to the shoulder. We called the police. When they didn't show up, we called again, and they told us to drive home if we could. The car sputtered and shook. It was hell all over again, just slower and drawn out. We kept having to stop. The gear shaft briefly broke off and he cried while trying to fix it. I had panic attacks until I passed out. Katsucon is in Washington. We were driving to his parents' house in Delaware. Normally a 3-hour drive. It took 6. The accident happened in the first 20 minutes of the trip. I still have nightmares. Story 41. My young son and his friend woke me up 5 years ago, whispering that someone was in the house. They were semi-pacing from my bed to the doorway, and my son had a metal pipe in his hand. I knew they were serious, but it still took my brain a second or two to process it. "Mom, there's a man in the house and he was in our room," my son stressed when I didn't jump up immediately. Well, that got me moving. They told me he was downstairs. I told them to stay upstairs as I slowly went down. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw a scruffy older man sitting on my couch, looking back at me like he was half surprised, half ready for confrontation. I asked, "Why are you in my house?" And he replied, "I'm looking for Ted, my neighbor." A bit panicked, I shouted, "Get out of my house!" And here's when I realized this guy was a real threat. Not just some confused man. He refused to move. In fact, he got angry at me for being upset. I turned to go back upstairs and nearly ran into my son and his friend, both ready with the metal pipe. I have to admit, it felt good knowing they hadn't let me face this guy alone. I called the police. The man stayed put until they arrived. He actually went out to greet them. The officers must have known him because they talked me out of pressing charges. They said he was from a halfway house a few blocks away and had gotten into an argument with someone there, so he left. They claimed he was just confused. A week later, I read in the newspaper that after being returned to the halfway house, he stabbed the woman who was his caregiver. The argument they had was about him wanting to leave and her refusing, per the law. So yeah, that man had a knife on him when he broke into my house. Story 42. Oh, this didn't happen to me, but to a friend. We were staying in a hotel room with a third friend. They were running a 50-mile ultramarathon the next day, and I was their pit crew. The room was really nice on the inside, but from the outside it looked like one of those creepy murder motel types you see in movies. 10 rooms lined up with keyed entry instead of key cards. The office was just a small room at the front. It was clean and well kept, but definitely not like a Hampton Inn with a lobby and interior hallways. My two friends agreed to share the bed closest to the window, which had the door right at the foot of it. Now, I stay in a lot of hotels for work and sometimes forget to lock the deadbolt because I'm usually in decent areas. As we were falling asleep, it hit me that the door led directly outside and I should double-check the lock. I got up quietly, thinking one of them might already be asleep, and checked the door. Just as I turned around to head back to bed, one of my friends opened his eyes hearing me fidget with the lock. With a little light leaking in through the curtains, he saw my 6 feet 3 inches silhouette hovering near his bed, in a shape eerily similar to the famous Bigfoot photo. He let out a startled sound, like two deep gasps with a hint of voice, and instinctively grabbed the other friend, making him the little spoon. The friend now being spooned started to say, "What the?" And before he could finish, the other whispered in panic, "At the door!" Meanwhile, I'm just standing there, frozen, still in my Bigfoot pose. The little spoon finally says, "It's just EB at the door. Relax." We laughed for the next 30 minutes straight. Story 43. I was about 7 or 8 years old at the time. My mom came into my room screaming, telling me to get up and get dressed. As a kid, that was scary enough on its own, but I listened. I got to the end of the hallway and saw my sister on a stretcher, unconscious and ghost white. I just stood there and threw up, thinking she was dead. First responders took her away, and my mom got me into the van to follow them. I fell asleep on the way there and woke up the next morning in the hospital waiting room. My mom told me that my sister's second kidney had failed and that she was long overdue for a dialysis treatment. It's been about a decade since then, and thankfully she received a kidney from my uncle. She's now a nurse practitioner working for the same doctor who performed both of her surgeries. She also volunteers at a camp for individuals with disabilities, some physical, some mental. I think 2 days of absolute psychological torment is a fair price to say my sister is a bona fide badass. Story 44. Every night for about 2 weeks, a black cat would sit across the street and stare at our house. My bedroom window had a view of the road, and sometimes before bed, I'd see the cat just sitting there, always staring. We had cats of our own, so we figured it was curious and wanted to make friends. It was strange, but not alarming. I sleep on my back and am a heavy sleeper, but one night I suddenly woke up. When I opened my eyes, it took a few seconds to realize that two big, alert eyes were staring directly into mine. The black cat was crouched on my chest, really close to my face. I was so chilled I couldn't move for 30 seconds. Then, as if nothing had happened, she lay down comfortably and closed her eyes. I petted her and went back to sleep. She never left my side after that, until she eventually disappeared, many years later. She just chose me as her human, apparently. Weirdest cat I ever had. Story 45. More than once I woke up to what looked like a man with a bird head storming around my room. There was what appeared to be a cloud of pestilence around him, and his movements were jerky and inhuman. Sometimes he would be accompanied by a dark-haired woman. They both wore gold jewelry, and one time it felt like I woke up to him boxing both of my ears with his fists. Anyway, time moved forward, and I ordered a book of creation mythologies from Amazon. It was a used copy, so it had no cover photo when I purchased it. When it arrived, the cover had the exact image of the bird-headed man I had seen, jewelry and all, in full color. According to the book, the character was Thoth, the Egyptian god of alchemy. I looked him up online, and it turns out he has a female counterpart, the goddess Ma'at. And wouldn't you know it, she looked exactly like the woman I'd seen with him on those nights. Story 46. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood. Everyone's friendly, and you'll see people out during the day saying hello as you pass. At the time, we were still new to the area, maybe about a month in. I was 17. One hot, humid night, I was up around 3 or 4 a.m. My bedroom is in the basement, and the cold air from the AC mostly stays upstairs, so I was only wearing briefs. I needed to use the bathroom and grab something to eat, so I went upstairs. I used the bathroom by the kitchen, then crossed the hall to the pantry. I grabbed the last hot fudge sundae Pop-Tart, which belonged to my sister, and put a strawberry one back in the box to cover it up. Evil, I know. As I walked back through the kitchen to go downstairs, I heard tapping, knocking from the sliding glass door that leads to our deck and backyard. Since our house is on a corner, the left side of the yard runs along the street. I immediately thought it might be one of my parents, which didn't make sense since the door was locked. I went to unlock it and something felt off. I turned on the porch light, and that's when I saw him. Some random guy leaning against the door, bleeding from his head and down his face. My heart basically dropped out of my chest. I sprinted upstairs to wake my dad, got dressed in record time, and ran back down. We decided to see if we could help him. Maybe he'd been in an accident. As my dad unlocked the door, we both silently agreed that if anything went wrong, we'd defend ourselves. We opened the door and asked what had happened. The guy, who looked to be in his mid-20s and wearing a leather jacket, mumbled something we couldn't understand. We quickly realized he had wiped out on his motorcycle. At first, we thought he had a concussion, but then we smelled the alcohol. We started cleaning him up. My mom and sister stood at the stairs watching. They went outside and found where he had crashed. His shoe, wallet, bike, and a bottle of Jack Daniels were scattered on the ground. A man in a truck had also pulled over after seeing the wreck, thinking he'd find a body. Once we saw the guy wasn't a threat, I went to help collect his stuff. We told the man in the truck what had happened. The bike looked new, only about 100 miles on it. The truck driver made sure we were okay and then left. Back inside, my dad was still patching the guy up. The stranger kept mumbling about his shoe, so I brought it over and helped him put it on. My mom had already called the police and explained everything. But my older siblings had pulled stuff like this before, though not as extreme. So my dad figured maybe we'd just play Good Samaritan and take him home, spare him a charge for one dumb night. Somehow we got his address. So my dad, the guy, and I drove him home. I had the address pulled up on Google Maps, and 15 minutes later we arrived. He unlocked the door and stumbled inside. We waited outside for about 10 minutes. No one came out. Finally, we said, "Well, guess that's that." By the time we got back home, the cops had come and gone. They weren't thrilled we'd taken him home ourselves. Once it all settled in, nobody could sleep. Around 4:30 or 5 a.m., my sister started baking cookies. Later, we all went back to bed. When I went back downstairs to shut down my PC, I realized I still had that Pop-Tart. And let me tell you, that was the best Pop-Tart I've ever had. Story 47. Around 12:30 one night, I got up to use the bathroom. My room was right next to it, just 2 steps away. I walked toward the door at a normal pace, which was pretty slow since I was half asleep. But when I opened the door, everything suddenly felt incredibly slow, like I was walking underwater. If you've ever tried to walk underwater, you know exactly what I mean. After what felt like an eternity, I opened the bathroom door and turned on the light. Instantly, everything started moving incredibly fast, like someone had hit the fast-forward button on me. I closed the door and sat down on the bathroom floor, holding my hands to my head and silently screaming, "What is going on with me?" It felt like I was genuinely losing my mind. Then I heard the bathroom door creak open, and when I looked up, I swear I saw myself standing in the doorway, looking down at me. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I jumped up, used the bathroom quickly, and rushed back to my room. When I looked at the clock, it was blinking 01:46. I had been in the bathroom for an hour and 15 minutes, fast forward a week or two. One night around 1:30, I got up again to use the bathroom. As I walked toward the door, I heard a faint voice scream, "What is going on with me?" I quickly opened the door and saw myself sitting on the floor, hands to my head. I blinked once, and I was gone. The next day, I tried telling my mom and dad about it. Of course, they didn't believe me.